the first step would be, how do we reduce the regulatory burden to encourage business investment here? Why is it so difficult to do business across the country? Right. So where are some of those pain points? What can you do to reduce those barriers? And this is a lot of what they are doing. This has been a lot of focus on how do we increase our productivity. Well, you can remove regulatory barriers. You can you can simplify taxation. There's a lot of things that they can do to actually make it a lot easier to do business in Canada.
I had the pleasure of speaking with the chief economist for the Calgary Real Estate Board recently. We talked housing, the economy, Alberta separation, and the global impact Canada has around the world, and more. It's a fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to share it with you.
Hello, Anne-Marie Lurie. Thank you for being here. We're talking housing, we're talking Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and the globe. What in the world is going on? And I'll give you for instance. Let's start simple. Affordability. Are we seeing a decoupling between prices and affordability? Break down what Calgary really looks like to the average person who just wants a house already.
Okay, so I think the first thing, especially when we talk about affordability, we got to remember, what are we talking about? Are we talking about affordable rental? Talking about affordable ownership? You're talking non-market housing, market housing? There's a big span. Now, when we look at let's park out the non-market stuff, different sort of segment. That's not really the space we operate in too much. But if we're thinking about the ownership side, there is still a wide spectrum. But oftentimes when I find people say it's so unaffordable, they're typically talking about your detached home, because they want a detached home and they find it difficult to get into. And I would say that, in this market, there is product availability. We finally have supply. We have supply choice. It does not mean you're going to get a detached home for $400,000. So I think sometimes it's about what price range are you operating in. What are you really looking at? There is a lot of condo product availability. There's a lot of product availability at lower price ranges up to higher price ranges. It really just comes down to location, where you're looking for, what product type. Where there's the most supply right now is in the apartment sector, and just because that's where a lot of the new construction has been. So that's causing different trends playing out in the apartment condo sector versus what you see in row or semi or detached. Detached and semis, there's still not a lot of them. The market's much more balanced than it was. But again, it depends on location and price range.
Right, because Calgary's very much a quadrant city. And Calgarians love their quadrants, right?
That they do, yeah.
But it's shocking. Just in the last 10 years, I think the benchmark price went from $350,000 to $750,000. That's huge. That's huge. And affordability, I'm thinking, condo pre-construction, they're going to run into some problems maybe, but condo fees, and even with townhouses, first-time home buyers, that has to be a magic number. And I'm seeing a lot of, especially older properties, having high condo fees.
That is the biggest challenge with the condos, and I think that's why a lot of people tend to turn towards the newer stuff, because the newer condos tend to have much lower condo fees. But that is one of the challenges with condos, apartment-style condos, is you've got those fees associated with it. So you have to, it's more affordable on price, but there's the additional monthly. So what does those condo fees include? What are you getting for that? Are you getting utilities? What type of reserve fund is in there? And that is a big challenge, just with what does that look like? And yes, usually that's why a lot of people turn to that row property, or townhomes, but then again, those are in different price points. As you start to get into row, it's a lot harder to get into there's a lot less supply in some of the lowest price ranges, unless, of course, you're going a little bit further out. Where there's more supply choice, especially in the 400,000 range, tends to be in some of the newer areas. Again, so part of the city really does matter. And I see very different trends playing out, so where the most price adjustments have happened tend to be either where there's a lot of new development happening, or, in that Northeast district.
Right, and our housing starts actually growing. Specifically, I'm going to say for Calgary and Alberta, because I know housing starts down east and even in Vancouver, Toronto, those metropolitan areas, the builders are just sitting on their land. They're not building anymore. They have it, they're sitting there, and they're waiting. And is that happening here as well?
No, it is different here. So
Okay.
we have had record starts. So so we had 3 consecutive years of record high starts. Last year, we've never seen starts in this level. We've had over 27,000 starts in Calgary last year. That's exceptionally high just for Calgary, and that's Alberta as well. So Calgary and Edmonton drive a lot of that, and they've had really high starts. But the challenge is you need to break out what types of starts have been.
Mm.
Okay, so out of all of those starts, over 17,000 of them are apartment style. And of that apartment style, 65% are rental. So it is really, so when you think about the ownership side of the market, there's a lot more rental construction that's happening right now versus ownership. Okay, now that being said, there was still a lot of condo starts last year, but again, it's apartment style units. That's where we've seen the largest growth. So apartment style units are up, almost 30% compared to the previous year. What's interesting to me is the detached starts have actually fallen.
Mm.
They're down by 6%. So you have to put some perspective to that, is that you're not getting starts evenly across all the things. So those numbers are pretty big, but they're big because there's a lot of apartment style product and a lot of it is rental.
Right, so blanket rezoning didn't really have a huge impact, or did it?
I think it depends on how you view it. Okay, so
Right.
the majority of the starts are still occurring in the newer communities.
Okay.
That is a reality. When I look at apartment style, even if I just looked at apartment style, and I've done some work looking at this kind of pre-rezoning to post-rezoning, I mean, we've had periods of time where there was a lot of redevelopment in the inner city anyways with apartment style starts. So it's not like that's changed anything. We've always had apartment starts that have happened in the downtown core and, the Beltline areas. And, so a lot of that apartment style product under construction right now is in the Beltline. So that's not entirely uncommon. Where we did see a bit of a shift is there's been definitely more row on the redevelopment side, at least as a proportion. But we got to remember, still 70% of the new starts activity is actually occurring in your newer communities.
Right.
So it's not that it doesn't happen. It's just it's still highly weighted to newer communities. And then there's implications on it, on the blanket rezoning as well. I mean, I've been doing some work reviewing like row homes. Because this is an area that they're saying, well, we need more row. Well, yes, we definitely got more row, even on the inner city. So the city center district, which is all redevelopment, there's been more row. Again, different price points. So what I'm finding happening is the newer stuff, the brand new stuff is at a much higher price point. So row properties are in that $775 is kind of that typical. For row property, stuff that's maybe a few years older, you haven't seen as much appreciation there, but they're still pretty comparable, right? And what's happened is that more older stock, so that stuff that's kind of more than 5 years old, that stuff we're not seeing, like, it's a bit of a tight market because there's just not as much stuff priced under $600,000.
Right.
So it's become a little bit tighter there. So again, depending on what the objective was, yes, we've seen some more row starts. They tend to be at a higher price point. The majority of the activity is still happening in new communities where the affordability is.
And it's interesting that you talk about the rental market, because it's almost like they're trying to play catch up with all that mass immigration for people who have somewhere to live. But the other side of the coin is I'm seeing a lot more senior housing rentals being built. And seniors, they spend their entire life in their home and sell their home not to pass on multi-generational wealth, but then to pay rent minimum $4,000 or $5,000 a month to live in an apartment complex. And I just feel like there's this huge gap in between because they can't afford to move there unless they sell their house. But they can't afford $4,000 or $5,000 a month either necessarily. And that leaves nothing for the next generation either. Like housing used to be a little bit more predictable in that regard.
Right.
So is there something in between? Like, is there something coming through in between so seniors can actually move out of their homes so someone can move up versus I deal with a lot of seniors and they're
Mhm.
staying home.
And I think that's kind of the challenge is what are the options? And I mean, some of the seniors, and again, you've got different levels of seniors housing, like what level of assistance do you need? You know, there's like the high degree of assistance versus no assistance. Well, if you don't need assistance and you're just downsizing, um, are you going to rent or are you better off buying a condo? Like, what are your options, right? And
Right.
I think that that's also another consideration. And then again, what are those fees and what does that look like? But I think that some of the challenges, especially where you need assistance, that's the stuff that, and again, that's non-market housing. So
Right.
again, seniors, that stuff kind of falls into the non-market and what type of assistance is available to them.
Right.
You know, sometimes you see this, you know, fairly high rent levels, and that's usually often including with services. How much subsidization do you get through the government, you know, like with your pensions versus what you have to cover? And that is a challenge.
Right.
I don't think that's a challenge that's going away anytime soon. And again, it's what level of assistance do they need and what's available, because there's that public stuff system and then there's private stuff, which is very expensive.
Yeah, the private independent living is very,
Very,
expensive.
very expensive.
Oh my goodness.
It is. And again, I mean, what is it, roughly 100,000 a year?
Right.
Just or depending on your level of care. And again, I have an aging family, and so I know I have a little bit of an insight into some of that, and it's a challenge.
Right.
And how do they get more facilities built that are not that? And again, that's non-market housing, so different sort of story. So yes, could they stay longer? Is there going to be more at-home care options? I'm not sure, right?
Right.
Different segment of the market, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. The other night, Danielle Smith spoke to Alberta, well, the world really. She was on YouTube, right? So anybody could listen in. And she raised a few points about, you know, what's been going on in Alberta. Tell us about the mass immigration and migration from other parts of Canada, and what you think the Alberta government can be doing, because they're asking a lot of questions about, you know, our infrastructure. How are we expected to absorb all these people and keep our schools and our medical and everything at world-class levels? And what do you think the people will say to her about that?
Well, okay, let's break down what has happened, right? So I think we really saw migration spike. 2023, 2024, and a lot of that was due to international migration. So there's a big difference between interprovincial and international. Yes, we had a rise in interprovincial numbers. Now, keep in mind, we were losing people on an interprovincial basis. From 2015 right up until COVID.
Right.
So even when people talk about the campaign to bring people in, we were losing people at that time frame, and that comes with its own economic challenges. Especially if anyone remembers that time in the housing market, it was very difficult. So we saw that turnaround in interprovincial start first. Now that was a lot of people coming from BC and Ontario, seeing the advantages in our market. And so we saw that those numbers rose. But at the same time, it's the spike. So what really caused the challenges, and this caused supply challenges in housing, it's why you've had challenges with schools, like infrastructure, like accommodating a population that basically is growing at a rate of, you know, we were seeing less than 100,000 migrants a year, like 70-some thousand. When it jumps to 200,000 migrants, that's a big jump. Okay, so that's part of the challenges that we were faced. So now, in many ways, the federal government has scaled back on the number of international migrants coming in. So those numbers are expected to be much, much lower. So that is changing moving forward. The question is, again, and as she's pointing out, you know, how do we accommodate that short-term growth that we had? And it does cause its own set of challenges. Now, on the housing side, it's kind of sorting itself out. The reality is, we had land to build. So we did. And now we're almost seeing the opposite effect of that. So now that those migration numbers are lower, we have all these units that are under construction that will be coming complete, and it's at a level that's higher than almost the new migration flows coming in. So I think some of the concerns on the housing side, and it will push down rents. So vacancy rates are higher, rental rates are coming off. Some of that challenge, especially on the housing front, is sorting itself out with the market stuff. Now, does it mean we'll have a lot of non-market housing? No, that's a different thing. But at least you should have more supply choice, and with more supply choice, we should limit some of that pressure on housing prices. Now, in terms of the rest of the infrastructure and what to do, I tend to stay out of politics best as I can. And it really is just a matter of, what happens if it continues? Like, what do you do moving forward? Oftentimes, it's the sudden spikes that are difficult to deal with. So I think that's kind of the thing to consider. Now we've come down to a period where it's no longer, those levels are not expected. So migration is expected to be much, much lower. Coming into more normal levels. And I think it's more about now as we move forward, how do we ensure that we avoid those sudden spikes again, right? So what does that look like moving forward?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because of, let's just take schools, for example, because that was a super hot topic last year with teachers. And because that's run provincially, yet you're planning new communities, future school here that never gets built. Like, is there a way that the city and the province could work together a little closer to say, listen, we're busing now from, let's take, for example, Coach Hill. All those kids up in Coach Hill used to go to school up in Coach Hill area. Now they're being bused down to Bowness. That doesn't make sense. There's obviously more children up there. So why not, when you're planning, like the Aspen community is out of control. It's actually getting a little too congested up there for my liking, but there's no new school, public school.
So here's the other challenge. If you stay in these people continue to stay in these communities, eventually these kids get older.
Right.
And then what happens? So you're going to build new schools for accommodating a certain population where you have a challenge right now. But what happens when that bulk of those kids are basically done with that school? So I don't think that the school issue is easy to solve.
No.
Because you do go through these ebbs and flows. I mean, if you look at certain older communities, how full are their schools? Because that's sometimes the challenge, right? So it's availability of schools, and I think that you hear about the new communities again and again. What are the demographic flows? What are your needs in those communities? How do those change over time? Is there a different way to look at infrastructure? Is there a different way to think about how schooling should work? And again, that's a whole different sort of scenario, because I think some of the challenges, you want to build these schools, but then what happens when your population starts to shift and age?
Right. Yes, I hear you on that point, absolutely. Because, I mean, we can see it.
Yeah.
And I actually, as a realtor, I'm seeing more couples going to older neighborhoods now versus the new ones because of the school.
Yes.
They want their child to walk to school or, be at least nearby.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that. But with our population projected growth, you're right, there has to be a better way.
Well, and again, I don't know, is that the best option of just building them, or is it considering what are our alternatives? And it's not necessarily busing, but is there other alternatives that can help meet that? And again, our population is expected to continue to grow, but now we have some time. It's supposed to be at a bit of a slower pace, because again, migration numbers are expected to come off.
Right.
So we're not going to grow at that same level of migration that we've had. So now that it's cooled down, what is the next, how do we plan for future growth? And I think that's a different sort of scenario, because even as you said, these newer communities, at some point in the future, there will be a school. Again, it's like, well, do we understand how the population flows within the city? One thing I've often said, they stopped doing census. The city stopped doing a civic census. So how do we know
Interesting.
where the flows are. Like, where are your shortages? Where are the biggest needs?
Right.
I think members know to a certain extent. Like you said, you have realtors. You're a realtor. You work with people, and they want a school.
Right.
So where are their options for, where are their shortages? And I think, again, that's a different challenge that I don't think is an easy fix. But let's start with some good data to understand. Where are your biggest shortages? Where are your biggest, what schools are empty?
Right.
Which ones have some capacity and which ones don't? What is the demographics within these communities? Like, how old are they?
Right.
Is this going to be a challenge perpetually, or is it a short-term challenge?
Right.
And is there other ways that you can do it? And I don't know. I'm not an expert on that by any means.
No, but I mean, infrastructure is really important.
It is important.
Especially when it comes to housing. And there's so many things I think that used to be predictable, but they're not. And now there's about, a million Canadians renewing mortgages in 2026? And I had the interest rates aren't high. Don't get me wrong, they're not like the 70s high.
Yeah.
But it's going to impact people, no? With the mortgage rates,
it can
test and
we have to remember, so mortgage rates have come down quite a bit from even a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not as high as they were a few years ago, which was really difficult. They're better than they were, and I think that, and there's been a lot of talk over, are people going to go and run into a lot of problems? You have to remember they were probably stress tested at a higher rate, so mortgage renewals are not as much of an issue. Now, new people coming in, though, it is a factor. Like, you have your cost of living. Maybe it's going to take longer to get into ownership. These are things that, again, fundamentally it depends on your house price.
Mm-hmm.
I would say we are in a far better situation in Calgary than some of the other major cities. We still have product availability in a wide range. Our detached homes, while they are much more expensive than they were several years ago, we are still well below what you can see in Vancouver, what you can see in Toronto. We also have to remember we have a lot of availability, not just within the city of Calgary, but in our surrounding areas that aren't that far.
Well, it's funny because the surrounding areas are really quite interesting, and we've seen a lot of growth. Cochrane, Okotoks, Airdrie, don't even recognize Airdrie anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get to Canmore.
Oh, Canmore's a whole different story.
And I'm thinking, okay, are those second homeowners that are typically buying in Canmore?
Canmore is different because it is more of a destination place, and I think a lot of even the homes have been set up to they have been set up to be attracting to investors or people with the plan that this is not their primary residence.
Right.
So it is a very different market. I mean, it is the most expensive market. In price point, like you see detached homes, they are pretty like 1.7 million or very high prices, and a lot more high density stuff in that market versus the low density, and even that is very pricey. And again, it's because it's a totally different market. It's not just your average person looking to buy something. It's more investor driven, more destination tourist base. Even like some of the stuff they're building, they build it with a different model in mind. They're building it with a rental style model, but accommodation rental, so more like hotel based business versus a living full time. So really different market. And again, right or wrong, it's a different assessment in that when you look at that market, it doesn't behave like most traditional markets in Calgary.
No,
and surrounding areas. It's very different.
I thought I'd put that out there because a lot of what I see other realtors putting online for YouTube is doomsday, housing, doomsday. Everything's doomsday, which attracts, people click on negative before they click on positive in the big picture. But you said, housing starts, they're decent. They're at a decent level. Could they be better? Is doomsday coming?
I think it's okay. So this is all about relative,
Right.
relative to what. So I think that some of the concern. There's no question. There's some concern in the high density stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You've got almost 18,000 units under construction right now. That'll be coming onto the market over the next couple of years. That 18,000 units under construction is really coming at a time when migration is now falling. So, you know, international migration, even if some of that's rental, with migration numbers expected in Calgary
Mm-hmm.
to be back around 20,000 people, when you've got 18,000 apartment only under construction and it's not one person per household.
Right.
So you can see that there could be a bit of a challenge there. And I think that that's where there has to be some perspective. And that's putting some downward pressure on condo prices. It'll likely continue to put downward pressure on condo prices until that some of that supply is absorbed. We have been here before.
Yes.
Okay, so this is not the first time we've dealt with this, and I'm sure it won't be the last time that we've dealt with this because we have land availability. So that segment of the market is facing some adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
What is not happening is you're not seeing that same degree of adjustment in the detached market.
Right.
So I'd say this market is very characterized by what property type are you dealing with,
Mm-hmm.
and what price range. Detached market is pretty stable. There are pockets. So think about the newer communities.
Right.
Where you have a resale home that's not that different from some of the newer product. Now, some of the price spreads are widening again. So because the detached side of some of those resale homes,
Mm-hmm.
they started to come off on their price.
Mm-hmm.
They've seen some adjustments. They've come down a bit because they know they're competing with all that new product. And the new home prices are still pretty high. So some of that could shift back towards resale. So there's always a substitution effect between new and resale.
Right.
We had a couple of years, there was no supply anywhere. And prices increased in everything. And I think now that the supply is shifting, that demand
Mm-hmm.
is stretching amongst different types of supply.
Right.
So things aren't as tight. Things are more shifting into more balanced. But the detached market, remember, that's not where there's been a lot of supply growth. Yes, there's some pockets. It's impacting some pockets of the resale market,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not as broad-based.
Not as broad. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to quote Sean Cathcart, who's a senior economist with Calgary Real Estate Association. And he's predicting, this is about a month ago, a 5.1% increase in sales in 2026. How does that compare? Like, he's talking nationally.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like for us locally?
Not the same. Okay, so
Okay.
so again, part of that is because, again, remembering national markets, a lot of that is to do with what happens in Toronto and Vancouver. And you
Right.
got to take almost a step back and understand that their sales
Mm-hmm.
have struggled for some time, and they're quite low. They're well below long-term averages. So both in Toronto and Vancouver, they've seen their sales be roughly 30% below their 10-year average.
Mm-hmm.
Calgary sales have fallen, but we have fallen from high levels. So we've returned to something a little bit more normal. We're more in line with long-term trends. Toronto and Vancouver are still well below long-term trends. So some of the increase is that they're just coming off of the lows.
Right.
So, some of those larger markets are coming off the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't expect our sales to rise this year. So in Calgary, I'm expecting sales to continue to fall. But again, they're falling, but they're still pretty consistent with long-term trends. Most of that decline happened last year. So we had a bit of a bigger fall last year. Again, a lot of that is because migration numbers changed and supply improved everywhere. So
Mhm.
now, again, that supply is being spread between new, resale. There's more rental. People don't have to make that decision on ownership as quickly, especially with rental rates coming down and more vacancy choice. So all of that is weighing in on our sales, but it's a different scenario. So even though they're saying their sales are rising, part of it's just because they're coming from such low levels.
Because they declined so much.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh.
So you
makes
always
sense.
need that perspective.
Well, and typically when people are worried about the economy, they don't make these huge financial decisions. And one thing people ask me about is the Canada, U.S., Mexico free trade agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone's saying what's going to happen in July. But so technically the agreement doesn't expire. It's just up for discussion.
Well, they're going to open it up. So the question is, and I think this is the CUSMA agreement, and I think this is where some of the risk comes in.
Mm-hmm.
We know that Alberta in general, most of our trade is CUSMA compliant, so that means they're not paying any tariffs.
Right.
Effectively, we are one of the provinces with the lowest tariff rate that we're paying to the U.S. Like we're in the lowest tariff scenario.
Mm.
So I think that the concern is if this gets renegotiated, will oil be off the table? And that's really the thing that has some people nervous about, is that, Alberta has been mostly exempt, other than obviously like lumber, a few industries here and there. But the energy sector has been mostly sheltered because of CUSMA. So the question becomes, if that's renegotiated, or maybe there is going to be tariffs, what could that impact be? And that's the uncertainty. And I mean, it's uncertainty we faced last year too. Last year at this time, there was a lot of uncertainty over even what tariffs are going to be, what's going to be impacted, what's not going to be impacted. And it matters because we export a lot, and most of our exports go to the US. Yes, we're exporting to different countries. Definitely having another pipeline it brings our oil to different markets. That's improved things in terms of how much, but still over 70% of our exports go to the US. So any type of factor that influences that can have significant economic consequences. So that's something just to kind of consider. It's one of those risks in the market. And it creates uncertainty. Uncertainty is never great when you think about the impact on housing. So again, it's one of those reasons why I think that, I don't expect to see much shift in sales activity this year. Right. And we've had the adjustment down. And again, still really consistent with longer term trends, just because we did have a lot of previous population gains that continue to support demand to a certain level. But again, when you're talking about shifts and improvements, well, there's nothing that's pushing that quite yet. And uncertainty doesn't really do well for anything in the market. So, and especially when it comes to buying a house, right? So I think that that's just something that's going to continue to weigh.
Right.
And then there's also uncertainty on the upside. There is some things that could happen on the positive. When we think about what could happen in terms of this MOU. Could we see more investment activity come into the province, and not just pipeline, but other levels? So with removal of some of those restrictiveness on emissions, as well as the clean electricity regulation, could that change things? Could that support better investment, not necessarily related to pipelines, but other sides of the energy sector? So that's another area that I find interesting, and we'll see how that plays out. Again, is it going to impact our market this year? Probably not. That might be something more that plays into next year and what we look like beyond this year. We know this year we have to adjust to the current supply that's coming. And we know this is going to impact especially the apartment condo sector, but it's a matter of how long will it impact it will depend on those economic conditions.
Right. Yeah, no, I find it all really quite fascinating because, in as much as people are in office for X amount of years, they really have to have a vision for like 50 years from now. And I don't know what that looks like when people say, oh, oil and gas, pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, to make a wind turbine, you need coal. So where does that all trade off? I don't know. I'm going to get to that a little bit later, because I still want to talk about homes. So CMHC tells us 3.5 million homes are required by 2030. It sounds like we still have a housing crisis besides the condo market.
Again, those are total numbers that they put out, and it's across the country.
Okay.
So some of the more challenge, and again, part of them is the discussion is regarding how much homes do we need to return to affordability.
Right. Okay.
Based off their affordability measure. And again, you have to put some context to that. We have not had problems adding supply here. Are we adding affordable supply? Depends on how you define affordable. Are we adding apartments? Yes. Do we have a lot of them? Yes. Is it a crisis mode? That really depends on your migration.
Yeah.
So again, if our migration numbers stayed really strong, we probably wouldn't see the same supply growth. We are seeing supply growth now because we've had all this construction at the same time that you've had an adjustment in migration numbers. So in terms of, what CMHC is reporting, I remind people that that's a national basis.
National blanket.
And it really does depend on location. You have to consider, Alberta was never cited as much of a concern as other locations.
Right. So what's the main impact here? I mean, we've talked about interest rates, not necessarily a deciding factor. Talked about consumer confidence.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to trigger this? Income growth? Like, what do people want? More money in their pockets, number one.
Yeah.
To be able to get into the housing market.
Mm-hmm.
But we also want to keep things balanced, stable, affordable. Like, where do you see Canada, Alberta in general, just kind of like, okay, this is a good level to be at now. There's this whole pattern that seems to happen, especially in Alberta, because of the oil, right? Like, we go up and we go down, we go up and we go down. And the barrel, what's the barrel today? $60? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
2 years ago, it was 100. Like,
and in our low time it was like 40. So I think that when, the first thing I tend to think about longer term, when I look at longer term trends, you want to see, what does the employment situation look like?
Right.
I have to remember, it still comes down to employment. It still comes down to where jobs are being created, what industries the jobs are being created. When we talk about energy, the reality is the energy sector still is our major sector here. Now, one thing I think people forget is there's clean energy, which is your green energy stuff. There's traditional energy. To me, it's not, or it's and, right? So you kind of need both. And I think that if you continue to see business investment, then that means it's going to continue to support employment growth and quality employment growth, which is essentially what you need, because that will help support stronger wages. And that's really what helps when you think about longer term growth, especially in housing. So those are really the key factors that I look for to support demand. Our employment numbers have been relatively strong. Yes, we've had higher unemployment rates as of late. That's mostly because more people came here than jobs were being created,
right.
Which is different. But we've also been creating some really good quality jobs for past several years. Now, some of that is shifting, and there's a bit of a pause that's expected this year. Employment's supposed to be pretty stable, so not a lot of growth this year. We have obviously had some challenges in certain sectors like manufacturing. That's somewhat tariff related. Not a surprise there. But as we move forward, that's what you're looking for.
Right.
Where's that business investment? Is businesses coming back? Are they creating, are they investing? They're the ones who really ultimately create jobs. That supports longer term growth, right? That supports that fueling, housing demand and everything else. When we talk about the supply that's coming on, again, how much of it's rental, that matters. Right. You need a healthy rental supply. It's not good to be in a scenario where you don't have a lot of rental. You need rental available at all price ranges, all rent rates, because that supports, again, attracting people here. Right? It's hard to attract people here if you don't have a healthy rental market. So they all work together.
Right. So I know you don't want to talk politics, so I'm going to ask you something political.
Talk about it.
It's just, I like your point of view. Like, oil and gas and clean energy can all live under the same roof. Absolutely. Diversity is what it's all about. Why are people, in general, I'm not going to name names, talking separatism?
There's all sorts of reasons why they could be talking about that. I think that, there has been some concern over how Alberta was considered being treated. I think that's where some of this comes from. How are we being treated relative to the rest of the country? I mean, we did go through a very difficult time here from 2015 to 2019. People were losing jobs in the energy sector. There was policies put in place that really caused a lot of struggles. That's preventing some of that investment activity. That's preventing our growth. So that was really an issue of concern. Now, some of those policies are starting to come back, right? So they're pulling back away on some of that stuff that was really problematic. Some people feel it just wasn't enough. Too little, too late.
Right.
we should get a better deal. You hear a lot of this, and I think this is where some of the frustration came from on the separatist side. Thinking, well, okay, would we look better if we're not, paying all these transfer payments, and would we look better for, all sorts of reasons? And I think that's where some of that sentiment comes from. Can we see better business investment? Some of the regulatory challenges makes it very difficult to attract investment. And this is a problem in Canada, not just, this is a national problem.
No problem.
And investment flows. So investment's hasn't been flowing here. Business investment has been cited as one of the biggest challenges.
Right.
And some of that problem is, they're saying, well, if we don't have these if we don't operate within Canada, maybe things would have been smoother. Maybe we wouldn't have felt that economic hardship. So I think that's where some of that comes from.
Well, that's interesting. It's seriously interesting. And I actually asked ChatGPT, what would Alberta look like if it's separated from Canada? And it was basically Swiss cheese. Because once you take out all the federal land and the indigenous land and the national parks, including Banff, it's not even possible for what that looks like without getting permission from everybody and, their next door neighbor.
Yeah, there is a lot of what you think it might look like versus what it might actually look like. What does transition look like?
Right.
It's not as simple as what people think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the challenge is, even if you think that we're better off, whatever that might look like in your future state, the transition will be very difficult.
Right.
And as you said, there could be legal challenges. What's really considered part of this? Would that be separated or would it not be separated?
Yeah.
So there is not, it's not simple. And I think that oftentimes when people talk about these things, they're not really thinking about what does this really look like?
Right.
And again, Alberta as an island on its own.
An island, yeah.
It is like we don't have access to ports. We don't, there's a lot of, you're gonna have to renegotiate everything. It's not so simple and clear cut. So this notion that we're just going to be much better off, maybe you can argue that in the future, but that really depends on a lot of things that have to happen in a certain way. So I don't think that that's a clear cut sort of, this is what this is. And I think, if anything, especially over short term, discussions of separation create a lot of risk.
Creates risk, creates tension between people. And I think we can all agree that, yes, how Canada was being handled under the government, it's not ideal. And we're not the only province, though.
No.
There is the other provinces have their own scenarios as well. It would be nice to be completely cohesive. And I think about Europe, and I think about not necessarily the EU, but for example, if you live in Italy or France or Germany, they don't have healthcare according to little quadrants. They have healthcare for their country.
Yeah.
Whoosh. Done.
Yeah.
Amazing. Of course, they encourage people to have a local doctor and not go from, Paris or whatever to Lyon for medical attention. But is that something that would bring the country together more? Something more universal?
That depends. There's pros and cons to it either way, right? Because, again, Canada, we span over a very large country.
Right.
We've got geographic, it's not like we can easily go across the country, right? So I think that when it comes to healthcare, it's always been a provincial thing. Is there a better way to do it? Potentially. I'm sure there is. Is national better? I'm not sure.
Right.
I think that there's a lot of ways to look at it, and there's different challenges in some regions. Would it be better in a universal system? I'm not sure. I don't know. I've never really looked at healthcare in that way. There's probably some areas you can achieve economies of scale, but is it going to be the same across? Because healthcare varies significantly across the country and per province. also availability. And I mean, I know a lot of people complain
Mhm.
about our healthcare system. I've heard a lot of complaints in other other provinces as well. They go, "Oh, Alberta's way better." So I think that it's, again, it depends. There's unique situations. What is important is making sure you can still continue to attract talent. That you have the people to work in these areas, and you have the right technology. Like, are we using technology efficiently?
What's also exciting about Alberta, and it's evolving more diverse. I think you and I are on the same page. You know, oil, gas, electricity, they're all necessary. But now I'm hearing about new developments in Alberta, and specifically a new data center near Olds or in Olds. And I thought that was fascinating because the infrastructure for all these data centers, when we talked about AI, that's what made me think of it, is how does that work? If we don't have the infrastructure, and we can come back to the city of Calgary and water, but I think everybody's played that one. How do we support a new data center with electricity in Olds? How it's cooled is going to be very, very important, right? But then how do we take it up a notch? For example, I thought about Olds College, which teaches agriculture. Do you use that excess heat for greenhouses right there out in farmland? Or do you put solar panels on top so it can create its own power source? Like, what's the plan?
So first and foremost, data centers are energy plays.
Right.
We have to remember they require a lot of energy,
Right.
And they require no downtime. So the problem is, like, even on a renewable basis, they need something that is reliable. So they need to have backups, and I think that some of the shifts, even in the MOU, like getting rid of the clean electricity regulation, or at least have an exemption in Alberta, is because most of our electricity is generated through natural gas.
Right.
So I think that's an important thing to remember. And you can't, if you're going to have data centers, you need reliable sources and consistent sources of energy. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity with the technology there. Maybe things will develop. You're right. Maybe they can find other ways. But the fact that now that they can use natural gas is important because it's reliable. So I think that you'll see more of that kind of come up now, more of that become a possibility than it would have been before. There's a lot of talk over nuclear.
Right.
But I don't know if the technology is there yet. So there is a lot of opportunity in general in this space. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of technology. It's a matter about, are we putting in the right resources into ensuring that we can look at these different options? I think we have a lot of potential in Alberta, just naturally because our climate is generally cooler.
Right.
Water can be an issue in some areas. But remember, the cooling is an issue for data centers. So natural advantages in some of our climate.
Right.
But what are the cooling options? So and again, not an expert on this level, but I do know that they need a lot of energy and they need reliable energy. So they need redundancy because downtime is a problem. So I think that, again, lots of opportunity. And when you think about long-term prospects, that's a good thing. It's, again, another area where you could see some growth and continue to see some growth. And I don't think you would have had it without some changes in some of those regulatory barriers. So I think that is important. And maybe they do build infrastructure. And maybe it's not just infrastructure with Alberta. Maybe it is looking at what other options you have with working with, BC, with Saskatchewan.
Right.
And I think that's important. You need to attract investment. And then that stimulates other levels of growth. So if you have more of that, and again, you talked about the tech side, partnering with universities, making sure you have a next generation of workforce that can come up with some of these solutions, that are investigating this stuff. That's all important. And I think that's a lot of the steps that Alberta is making. We've been doing a lot of that sort of thing.
A lot. No, and that's really cool. And actually, you made me think about one of my notes here for the nuclear, the small modular reactors. Okay, so they seem to make sense. And can-do reactors were actually invented in Canada, were they not? Originally, I think that's where you get the can-do from. But why not add that into the fold? I mean, nuclear, I think, sounds scary to a lot of people because of the potential fallout. But in this day and age of technology, AI, there must be a way to, as a smaller unit, not the really big ones.
They do
that.
want to add this into the fold.
Okay.
The challenge is it takes time.
Right.
These things do not happen overnight.
Right. 50 years from now.
Yeah, like they are. This is something that they're looking at. There's no question that this is something that they're looking at as options, but it's just not there yet.
Mm.
And even if you're going to get there, it's going to take time to get there. So
Right.
again, the challenge is you want to achieve these objectives. That's great, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of investment
Right.
to do these things, and this does not happen overnight. So it's nice to say, yeah, I want that, but how long is it going to take for you to get there? And in my understanding, it's still several years away before they could do something like that. It's not that it's not achievable,
Right.
but then it also has to make economic sense.
Right. Well, and I just think about, the EV movement for electronic vehicles, which I'm not adverse to, because you need oil for so many things besides just cars, right? I mean, I want to go on vacation. Hey, need a little jet fuel, please.
Yeah.
But where does Canada get that added electricity from? Like, the grid is full.
So you
It's
need to
full.
build power plants, and that requires what? So in Alberta, it's natural gas.
Right.
So this is, again, that shift away from that, because the part of the clean energy regulations was, clean electricity regulations was, well, you can't use natural gas. What do we do if we don't have that? We don't have hydro.
Right.
So that's a bit of a challenge. So that removal of that can actually open up other opportunities. And again, that was one of those issues that was cited as, how are you supposed to meet these power needs if you can't use natural gas in Alberta?
Right.
So I think that shift away does offer some of that opportunity, because you need electricity to, again, you need that. Just like you can't have data centers without, how are you going to fuel these data centers?
Right.
They need power, and a lot of it.
And a lot of
And how are you going to build to that power? So I think that is where I think some of that shift is happening now, and that there's a realization. It's nice to say you want these things. That's great to say, let's just all use hydro. It's not feasible in all locations. It's a lot easier in certain markets where they have a lot of hydropower.
like BC and Quebec.
BC, Quebec, actually, so there's just other locations that it's a lot easier than here on the prairies.
Right.
And yes, nuclear is an option, far away. It's still not there. So I think that is some of the shifts in recognizing we have a lot of natural gas. So we're not burning oil. So I think, again, that's at least where I see that there is some opportunity.
Right, right. Well, and I mean, really, the manufacturers of green energy are overseas, and they are burning coal in order to do that. So the globe actually has to get under the same umbrella to make a huge difference. Because Canada, what are we? 1%? 1% of the population.
I know, and I think that we are doing, even having carbon capture and storage. There's advantages to all of this.
Right.
So again, it's the and, not or.
Right.
And I think that's the important distinction. You still need energy. That's not going anywhere anytime soon.
No.
So let's look at all those different options and how do we capitalize on it. Again, I'm not an engineer. I'm sure people are studying this all the time. We have lots of hydrogen. How do we take advantage of that, right? So looking at all of those options and figuring out what makes sense, and does it make economic sense.
Right, and will that attract people to Alberta that are going to be the brilliant minds?
It can, if you have the right environment to see the business investment.
Right.
So again, you need the incentive to create that for businesses to invest, not, and again, it can't be the or, it has to be everything, right? So.
Yeah, investment. Well, diversity is important, and Calgary's I don't know why I can't get over this, but it's the sunniest place in Canada. Right? But I've been seeing a few reports about solar fields going in farmland And that doesn't make me happy, because we have all these parking lots, all these buildings, all of this already existing property, parking lots, for example. Why not just go solar on that and see what happens? Would that take some pressure off the grid?
And it's about reliability. Is the sun shining when you need it to shine?
Right.
Storage. How do you store it?
Right.
I don't know if storage is quite there. So I think that's some of the challenges with it. So how do you ensure, if you're adding solar to the grid, that's fine, but how do you ensure you still have stuff for when the sun doesn't shine? When it's cold. and again, it's like solar, wind, we have all these things. Is it enough to meet that demand?
Right.
Especially during peak periods.
Well, and I'm curious how all of this actually adds to the job market. Like, for example, the data centers we were talking about. Initially, when it's being built, sure, there'll be maybe 2,000 jobs created. But once it's built, you don't need nearly the number of people, and you also need different types of people to be employed at those data centers.
Sure.
So how does that build the economy to put money in people's pockets in the long term so they can have a house of their dreams?
Well, it's not just building the data center. Think about the electricity or the energy that's needed to service the data center.
Right.
How many spin-off jobs to come out of that?
Right.
Through the development of that initial part, but also for people to run and manage that in the same way. So I think that, again, it's about what types of quality jobs are you creating. There is that side, but there's the spin-offs from it. The other aspects of the sector. So like, how much does that create within the energy sector?
Right.
And the need to service those data centers.
Okay.
And then, so not just the data center jobs, but those other positions as well. And then they all filter through. So if you have more people working in the energy sector per se, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, those have spin-off effects onto other industries, right? So again, it's about industry growth in general. It creates good paying jobs, but then it also filters through all different industries, and then it trickles down into all aspects of your economy.
Okay. Well, no, that's good. That's good for long-term outlook, because, and that's why I wanted to ask you the question, because I'm thinking, well, how is this going to impact the big picture? So let me ask you, if you were, in a perfect world, advising policymakers today, what is the one structural change that would most improve economic resilience and affordability over the next decade? So get your crystal ball out. 10 years from now, what would make the most difference?
I would say the first thing is you have to do things to encourage business investment. Governments don't tend to create jobs, so you want to create an environment that attracts investment to your country.
Right.
So what can you do to ease regulatory barriers? What are pain points for businesses that they're going to choose, that they're choosing other countries to invest versus us? So I think that the first step would be, how do we reduce the regulatory burden to encourage business investment here? Why is it so difficult to do business across the country? Right. So where are some of those pain points? What can you do to reduce those barriers? And this is a lot of what they are doing. This has been a lot of focus on how do we increase our productivity. Well, you can remove regulatory barriers. You can look through you can simplify taxation. There's a lot of things that they can do to actually make it a lot easier to do business in Canada. And I think that would be your first step. If you can create business opportunities here and you can attract business investment, then it filters through. It filters through in consumers. They can get better paying jobs.
Right.
And it filters all the way through, and housing really is the fallout from that at the end.
Right.
Right. So I think that to me should be the main focus, is how do we encourage business investment? What do we need to do? How do we look relative to other countries? What could we do better? What could we do better across the country?
Right.
There is different rules in every province. Can we make that a little bit more seamless? Can we make it easier for labor to flow? What other things can we do? And again, I think there is people who are looking at this in mass.
Right.
Because productivity has been a challenge for quite some time.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I wasn't really quite sure how to explain it. So thank you for for doing that, because I don't think people really think about that in the big picture.
Yeah.
You know, day-to-day lives, right?
Well, you can think on basic levels. So if you've got a realtor here, you can't just operate in another province, right? You have to go get licensed.
Right.
You have to go, understand different rules in different provinces.
Yeah, and actually that's an interesting point, because I am licensed in 2 provinces, Alberta and BC, and literal almost polar opposites on how they operate. Like, it's fascinating to actually see that when you drive 3 hours to BC.
So imagine that across all different industries.
Right?
And if a company is trying to operate across the entire country, what frictions does that cause?
Right.
And then it just becomes it's just easier somewhere else.
Right.
So that's where there could be a lot of work that's done. Like, and I just use that as an example, and you can see that, like, it's different.
Yeah. No, I know. I'm living the dream. Well, and you mentioned Canada and diversification, and on a personal note, Canada has a lot of grants for scientists to attract the scientific and engineering community to the country. And I am going to do one little tidbit about this personally. My son is doing his postdoc in Sweden, and he got his PhD in France, and he'd really like to come back to Canada, but every time he applies they say no. Meanwhile in Canada they have all of these immigration plans to attract people from other countries that aren't necessarily Canadians,
right,
to get funding.
Yeah.
So I'm like, is there, like, okay, how do we get the talented Canadians to come back, maybe number one, but number two, I don't understand if they're trying to attract people. And I mean, it's just a coincidence this is happening in my world personally, right? But I thought, regulations? Like, what's going on?
Well, and funding is a different, so again, I think that at least one positive shift is at least immigration is more focused now on where we need labor.
Right.
So that is a bit of a shift. I mean, before it was just, let's open up everything. Now it's more targeted.
Right.
Which isn't a bad thing. I think it's really is important to, kind of go back to where do we need workers? Where do we have shortages of labor? Why don't we try and immigrate to fill in where there's shortages?
Right.
That's an important thing. Now, again, on research grants and attracting that talent, some of that could just be, again, where are you focusing your efforts?
Right.
Where do you want to grow your economy? And I think that, again, it's focusing on how do we, if you're going to attract those high value people, where do you want to do the research in?
Right.
And I think, that is something that, again, depends on budgets, right? They are making some shifts. Like I said, there's been a lot of shifts even on immigration, on how it went from. Now it's more targeted, more approach to what you need, which is a good thing. Right, because you still need migrants to fill in,
right,
for sure.
Yeah.
And now again, it's like, if you're going to focus on research and you're going to focus on new development, how are you going to, like, what are you going to pick?
Right.
Right. So where is that funding going to encourage development in certain industries? Again, I don't know how much they have in their budgets for these things, and they have to weigh that all out. I would like to see more go towards how do we encourage investment?
Right.
Right. It'll have far longer term benefits as opposed to just, and I know consumers don't necessarily like that, but appeasing like the average consumer.
Yeah.
We know that people struggle with cost of living, but I'd rather see those funding go towards something that can actually support further growth.
The economy has such an amazing impact on absolutely everything that happens. And I'm thinking, to come full circle, that's why Danielle Smith is asking people their opinions about immigration. But it sounds to me like that entire structure is already in the works to change how immigration is handled.
Yes, and it's going back to something that, again, and I think the challenge is what we went through, like that doesn't serve anyone really well. It doesn't serve the immigrant, like, you want to set them up for success too, right?
Yeah.
So, bringing people here without necessarily a job or there's that long transition for them to get into a position, that can have its own challenges, right? So we want to make sure we're attracting the right people for the right sort of roles.
Right.
And it's not, that's just how we used to do it. So going back to something like that and just taking a more measured approach, is, again, something that we used to do, right?
Well, and I mean, when my parents immigrated to Canada,
Mhm.
they had a job before they got here.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a fancy job.
Mhm.
They had the job that had to get done until, they assimilated, learned
Yeah.
the language, got educated, et cetera, et cetera. And that just makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it's nice to see that these guidelines are going back in place, because it's nothing new. It's just it went by the wayside for so long.
It did, and when you're bringing in so many people over a very short time frame, that has challenges.
Mm-hmm.
It really does, because it's hard for, just like in the housing, we saw it. It's really hard to add that supply in time, because supply takes time to add. They can't just build something on in a day. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
There's the planning process. There's the time that it takes from like starting that like from a start, from the minute they get the shovel in the ground. There was years before they can get the shovel in the ground.
Right.
And then they get the shovel in the ground. There's still that period of construction.
Right.
So when you have a sudden change, it's really hard to quickly adjust. So when you're having a more measured approach, it becomes a lot easier for your economy to absorb additional people. And it's a more stable growth environment.
Yeah. No, so the outlook is sounding a little better.
Again, relative to what? So I think that on housing, I mean, it does feel different because we went from a market, and again, it's all perspective.
Right.
For a buyer versus a seller, we went from a market where the sellers really did have the advantage, and they had the advantage for 3 consecutive years, where there was really strong price growth. There was very limited supply options. That's changing now. There is more supply growth. There's more supply options. Sellers can't push in the same way. Things are returning to more balance, and in some cases, buyers have the advantage. So I think that's where there's a bit of a shift on the housing front. On the economic front, again, a lot of that growth over the past couple of years was driven by sudden shift in population. There is a lot of potential upside, but we do need to work through a few things.
Right.
So there is still a lot of risk. The economic conditions, again, Alberta is expected to grow at a faster pace than every other province, but it's still a slower pace of growth.
Still a slower pace of growth.
Yeah.
So what keeps you up at night? Are you worried about anything?
I'm pretty worried about what could happen if a referendum actually becomes, in print. That's the best way to put it. That's something that I'm a little concerned about. I'm also concerned about what could happen on tariffs and that moving forward. What do we look like? What does this, are we going to see development? Are we going to get a pipeline? That's the stuff that really is going to drive future growth. And there is a lot of things that can sway it one way or the other. I think for my biggest concern is if we do go into a separation referendum, that's going to create a lot of uncertainty. That's going to throw all my forecasts out the window, just because of what that could do, right? The uncertainty that could create. Are we going to be under a new trade agreement?
Right.
And what does that look like? That's the uncertainty that we don't know how that can really derail some of the good things that we have going.
Well, I'm glad you said that out loud, because I think a lot of people are not, they don't know where to turn for answers. And they just see all the chaos and chaos and chaos being thrown at them. And really, we're a nice country here. It's still true. And we have so much to offer the world. So globally, it's comforting to see other world leaders, supporting Canada and buying our goods. And
but we still need the U.S.
Right?
They're our biggest trading partner, so there is a balance there.
But doesn't the U.S. need Canada? Like I'm talking water, electricity, even oil. I mean, sure, they get oil, heavy crude from Venezuela. I'll never pronounce that right, but
Venezuela, they took over Venezuela for a reason. But I think that, yes, they still need us, for sure. I think that there's certain pockets that I'm sure, like, they'll feel it to a certain extent. But we are so tied with them, and we've been tied with them for years.
right.
But we're just so much smaller in terms of our size of our economy.
Mm,
It's a little harder for us to absorb things versus them.
right.
So,
Well, one thing I have to say is our healthcare system, in as much as it has challenges, at least we have one, you know? And that, to me, is more appealing to live in Canada than ever to go south.
oh, for sure. And I mean, I mean, I like Canada. I don't know, I'm a Canadian. I'm an Albertan.
Right.
There's a reason why you choose to live here,
Right.
right? There's a lot of advantages. Now, again, what happens? I mean, would I just prefer if we just get along and, do what's most efficient? That would be great. But again, we have to be, even as Canada's resilient, like, we need to start thinking beyond just what the U.S. is, but we have to remember we still need them right now.
Right.
So there is a bit of balance in there over what we short-term versus long-term, and really thinking about how do we grow, right? Where are our opportunities? What are we good at?
Right.
And how do we capitalize on what we're good at? Location advantage is no question with the U.S. It is just proximity. We benefit from that. And we have benefited from our close proximity.
Right.
And yes, more trading partners isn't a bad thing.
Right. What about our oil industry for head offices? I hear Shell is packing up.
I'm not sure how many of them are packing up. Like, we've already seen some shifts happen there.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of them are very integrated, like U.S., Canada. That is something to watch for. We have had a lot of those positions be, some in Canada, some in the U.S. If they start pulling out of some of the Canadian locations, and again, what are they doing? Well, that has an impact.
Right.
Even them scaling down, right? And I think that's something to sort of watch for if that's something that continues. And some of that will depend on if they're expanding their Canadian operations or not.
Right. Well, I have seen some companies move their head office to Alberta, but no people.
Right. Well, and you saw Imperial. Like, you've seen some of these shifts, right? That they don't necessarily need as many people there.
Right.
And again, that's something to sort of watch for. Is as the energy sector embraces technology, what could that mean for employment?
Right.
So that is something to sort of watch for sure. And again, if they're not investing in growing, then do they need more people?
Right.
So that again still comes down to some of that business investment climate. If it's just steady state operations, that doesn't have the same new demand needs on employment as opposed to if they continue to grow.
Yeah. Well, it'd be nice if a few of these projects get fast tracked.
Yeah, and you could see further investment and further growth, the need for more engineers, the need for additional areas within that sector. So it's important. That's why that business investment piece is really important to consider.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for the future. I hope other Canadians are as well. But
I think there still is a lot of opportunity.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes you got to go through some of the struggles.
Go through some of the struggles and understand that when you hear a blanket statement that housing's going up or down, it depends on what type of housing, where it's located.
Absolutely. Even within our city, there's a big difference depending on what part of the city you're operating in.
Right.
Some of the price adjustments are far more significant in the Northeast District and sometimes the North and the Southeast, where there's a lot of competition from new versus areas where there's not necessarily a lot of supply.
Right.
Sometimes what you're dealing with in the new home versus the resale, very different. And I think it's important for anyone that when you hear a blanket statement, I'm like, well,
Yeah.
it doesn't quite work that way. There can be variations within price range, within location, and property type.
Right.
Especially when you have supply choice. When you had no supply choice, everything was rising everywhere.
Yeah.
That's what's changed.
So, and that part was actually a little bit predictable because you did see where most housing was being built. And it just kind of like,
Well, and when we had no supply anywhere, there was no supply in rental, no supply in new, nothing in resale. Not a surprise that prices went up
right.
across all aspects. Like, it's not a surprise rent went up. Well, when you have no vacancy, that's what happens. It drives further gains in the condo market because now some people might have been pushed out of rental and might have went into condo,
Right.
because they were facing a 20% rent increase, right? So all of that, and that scenario wasn't healthy either. Like,
No.
having no supply is not a healthy scenario, and moving back into something a little bit more normal is not a bad thing. Now, some sellers might feel differently. I'm sure sellers like the advantage of when things are in that type of scenario.
Well, and builders too, right?
Yeah.
So that'll be interesting to see what transpires.
Yes, for sure.
Well, Anne-Marie, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Is there anything we haven't discussed that you think you should mention?
Oh, I think we covered everything. Yeah, for sure.
And so, okay, great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Calgary looks like a model city from up here. Our ride's as smooth as it gets. This lion knows what it's doing. We'll catch you on the next adventure.